this up, if we can tonight, but Mark chapter 6 tonight. And this is a wonderful story about Jesus walking on the water. And so you probably heard this story, but I want to try to express to you the significance of the story. Because if you don't understand the significance of the story, you'll miss it, okay? Everybody knows that Jesus actually walked on water. People have been trying it for years. I tried it one time, and it didn't work for me. But some of you read some things about Scientology, for instance. We've been exposed, most of us in one fashion or form, to Scientology. But oftentimes we've been introduced to it through the back door with different people like Kirstie Alley or John Travolta or Elizabeth Moss. There's at least 60 people in Hollywood that attest to Scientology. Probably the most famous one is Tom Cruise, right? And so, but Scientology is really a set of beliefs and practices invented by the author. He's an American author, actually, L. Ron Hubbard. He died in 1986. He's a science fiction writer and a medium. And this is what he says about Jesus. And really, only the most indoctrinated Scientologists get to read Hubbard's secret writings. But this is what he says, and I quote, "Jesus never existed as a person, but rather he is an electronic idea implanted by the true powers of the universe into the mind of someone between incarnations around 600 BC. This implant is labeled R6. Jesus is nothing more than an electronic, mystical, biological implant, and the implant has all the characteristics of a pedophile." And if you read the blasphemy of L. Ron Hubbard, he will say this. For instance, the historic Jesus was not nearly the sainted figure he has been made out to be. In addition to being a lover of young boys and men, he was given to uncontrollable bursts of temper and hatred that belied the general message of love, end quote. So Scientology really has always been known as a cult, but it is a demonically formed pseudo-religion. What I'm reading and seeing is that there is really a breadth of tolerance that define much of New Evangelicalism. And I want to talk about that a little bit tonight. Some people feel that if you are just a monotheist, if you believe in the one true God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, like the Jews do today, if you believe in Yahweh and miss on Jesus, it's okay, you'll still end up in heaven and be fine. And Jesus says in Luke chapter 20, "Beware of the scribes who like to," and I'm quoting, "walk around in long robes and love greetings in the marketplaces and the best seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at feasts." He says this in verse 47, "who devour widows' houses and for a pretense or for appearance sake make long prayers. They will receive," he says, "the greater condemnation." Now, those are startling words. Whose son is this Christ? See, it goes all the way back in that text to verse 41. How can they say that the Christ is David's son? And what happened was these religious leaders, they made the wrong conclusions about who Jesus Christ was. And it was devastating. Not only will they have no salvation, they will, Jesus says, have condemnation, and they will have a greater condemnation. The whole Judaistic system is coming down. Now, what marked the system? Well, it was the temple that marked the system. And that came tumbling down, did it not, in 70 A.D. by the Romans, Titus, and he left no stone upon another. And Jesus prophesies that it will be leveled to the ground, matter of fact, in Luke chapter 21 and verse 6. So, here's the point that I'm trying to make. You can't extend and expand the gospel to just anyone in their belief systems. They have to conform to the Scriptures. If they just believe in the God of the Old Testament, that's not enough, Jesus says. He says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh unto the Father but by me, he says. So he's not sitting down, Jesus, during his day and age and says, let's just find some common ground here. Let's just dialogue about who I am and the importance that I am. He's not doing that. Jesus didn't look for common ground at all. He could have a conversation. Well, he didn't even do that. Rather, he had a condemnation for them. He pointed out the damning nature of rejecting him. Now, I'm going to say this. Let's keep our finger in Mark 6 and let's go to John chapter 6 because you've got to see this. Because this follows about 12 hours later after of this story that we're having here. Now, remember last week, we had talked about the feeding of the 5,000. The ministry of the Lord Jesus took place over a 3-year period of time. The first year, it was primarily his Judean ministry. The second year, it's his Galilean ministry. He's already been over Galilee twice. Now he's going back over Galilee the third time. There's 200 villages. There's 200 towns in this region of Galilee here at large. I'm showing here the Sea of Galilee, all right? But in this region, there's about 200 towns and villages. It's a densely populated area that Jesus is going over during his second year of ministry. He has shown power over disease. He has shown power over demons. He has shown power over death. And he has shown power even over nature. We've looked at that already in Mark chapter 4 with Jesus calming the storm on the Sea of Galilee. This is the same sea, the Sea of Kinnereth, as it's referred to, or the Sea of, it gets its name, another name from this little town here called the Sea of Tiberias, all right, as it's called. So we're in the last part here of chapter 6 of Mark, and we're going to look at verses 45 through 52. And this is a wonderful history of the Son of God. Matter of fact, every story here in the Gospel of Mark is presenting Jesus Christ in his credentials as being the Son of God. We have to go all the way back to Mark chapter 1 and verse 1, right? I mean, this is his testimony. In every one of the Gospels, it's like this. They are presenting Jesus Christ for who he really is. He is the Son of God. He is God clothed in the flesh. So every paragraph, every section is like a pointer to Jesus Christ and who he is. It's consistent in all 4 of the Gospels. And Mark wants us to see Christ in his glory. He wants us to see him in his majesty. And last week we happened to look at the feeding of the 5,000. It's only one of 2 miracles that are recorded in all 4 Gospels. The resurrection of Jesus Christ from the grave is recorded in all 4, as well as the feeding of the 5,000. But it really wasn't the feeding of the 5,000, right? I read one theologian this past week who believes it was the feeding of the 25,000. These were 5,000 men themselves, plus women and children, okay? Plus singles, etc., that were women. They're coming. And if you noticed last week, this was one of his greatest miracles that he ever performed. That's why it's recorded in all 4 Gospels. You say, well, why? Well, he made food, and the text that we ended with is, these men gorged themselves. They were completely satisfied. It's like eating 3 cordon bleus this coming Friday night. It's not just one. I mean, you fill the tank up, as it were, right? and there were 12 baskets left over. 12 baskets left over, one for each one of the disciples. So it was interesting. It wasn't just, a happenstance that 12 baskets were left over. More was left over than what Jesus had started with. He had multiplied the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. And this is the power of it. This is the precision of his miracle that he was performing. Now, Jesus is really at the apex of his Galilean ministry. His popularity has spiked. All right? Think about it. 20,000 to 25,000 people. It has spiked. The enthusiasm reaches a fevered pitch. And in John 6, that's where we're at right now, in verse 14, look down there with me. Then the people saw the sign that he had done, the feeding of the 5,000. They said this is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world. Perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. You understand what's happening here? They wanted to start a rebellion. This is their mindset. They wanted to take him by force and make him a king. Now, Jesus is right up here in this region here called Bethsaida Julius. That's where he fed the feeding of the 5,000. He had demonstrated his power. They wanted to start a rebellion. Wouldn't that be great to have Jesus leading an army? He could heal the dead. He could heal people. So if you were stabbed, he could heal it and take care of you. He could feed an army. Why wouldn't you want Jesus leading a rebellion like that against the Roman Empire? But he wasn't going to have a coup. The first time he came to this earth, he did not come to kill, but to save in order that he might die for our sins. The second time he comes, you mark it down, he's coming to kill. He will come as judge. He will slaughter the godless of the world. Jesus didn't have a political agenda. He didn't have a social agenda, right? He had a spiritual agenda. He came to offer salvation. And Revelation chapter 20 tells us that he will reign for 1,000 years over the whole earth. And he will come and reign. The people wanted temporal things. He saw them for what they really were. One author, D.M. Hebert, talks about their apostate religion at the time was Judaism, and they were just thrill seekers here at this time in Jesus' ministry. Now, hours later, on a spring night, remember the grass was still green? He made them sit down in heavy green grass, all right? So it would have been the spring of the year. But 12 hours later, they will meet Jesus with an entitlement spirit the next day. They think he has inaugurated the welfare state of their generation, right? They want breakfast the next day. Well, he's not going to give them breakfast. What he's going to give them is a message, a sermon, and he gives it here in John chapter 6, verses 22 through 59. We don't have time to look at it tonight, but it's called the Sermon on the Bread of Life. And he's going to say to them, I'm the bread of life. I am here not to feed you physically, I am here to feed your spiritual souls. Notice in John chapter 6 and verse 66, a key text. And he said, this is why I told you that no one can come to me unless it is granted to him by the Father. After this, verse 66, many of his disciples turned back and no longer walked with him. These are the mathetes. These are in what Greek calls the disciples. These were the followers of Jesus. These were the learners of Jesus. These are the disciples that turned back after this sermon on the bread of life. Now, what made the difference? Okay? Maybe you're thinking to yourself that these guys are just, something happened. What happened to them? Now, notice what happens in verse 67. So Jesus said to the 12, there's 12 that didn't turn back. He says to them, do you want to go away as well? Are you going to desert me? Are you going to depart at this time from me? Now, think about the disciples. The 12 had the same expectations as those other mathetes, the other disciples, the other followers, the learners that were following Jesus in the droves, right? Who would be the greatest in the kingdom? Do you think any of Jesus' disciples asked that question? Hey, two of them even got their mother to ask on their behalf which one would sit at the right hand and which one would sit at the left hand of the Lord Jesus. Remember that? I mean, did they want Jesus to deliver them from Rome? Of course they did. They were interested in the here and now, these 12. After the resurrection, will you not bring the kingdom to us, they said. This was the messianic construct of the day and age in which Jesus was ministering. They wanted Jesus to usher in the kingdom. And for the first time, we see that Peter rises out of this group of 12 men and he speaks. Notice what he says in verse 68 of John 6. Simon Peter answered him, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. Those are key words that he's saying here, all right? And we have believed and have come to know that you are the Holy One of God, Peter says. Now, so these 12 guys are understanding a different reality. What made the difference between these 12 guys staying with Jesus and the other disciples, okay, leaving Jesus? What made the difference? Our story does tonight. This story is the capstone that makes all the difference with these disciples in how they view Jesus truly. We have come and believed and have come to believe that you are the Holy One of God. Now, this is a monumental time. Go back with me to Mark chapter 6 and verse 52, because the feeding of the 20,000 or the 5,000 men and women and children, that didn't do it. Notice in verse number 52, and they did not understand about the loaves. We're in Mark chapter 5 and Mark 6, verse 52. But their hearts were hardened. So that isn't what did it for them. This did it for them. Jesus walking on the water. Now let's read the text. Immediately, isn't that a favorite word of Mark? Okay. Immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. Now, it's not talking about this Bethsaida over here. He's talking about this Bethsaida over here. Okay, they're going to follow this shoreline. So they're coming here and they're going to head in the direction of Bethsaida. Okay? John tells us that they are actually going to Capernaum, which is this 4-mile trip. So it's going to be at night. What do you think they're going to do? They're going to stay close by the shoreline and they're going to track and trace all the way to Capernaum 4 miles away. So here's the picture here. Notice verse 46 of our text in Mark 6. And after he had taken leave of them, he went up on the mountain to pray. Now, he let them go, right? They got in their boat and they left. He has to dismiss this crowd. That's what he's going to do. Let me just say this. There are three scenarios and three scenes that we have before us tonight, okay? The first scene is the master praying. That's the first one that we're going to see here in verse 45 and verse 46. I want you to see a couple things. That night, they went, and they're going to go from fear to faith. That's what's going to happen. That night, they're going to go from confusion to confession. That's what's going to happen. That's what Peter just said in John chapter 6. They're going to go from wondering to worshiping. And that's what's going to happen here. And this narrative that we have makes all of that happen. So that's why this scene that we're on here in Mark chapter 6, you wouldn't want to be anywhere in planet Earth other than right here tonight to get this truth. All right? There's nothing better. I don't think there's a football game on tonight that's this good. No, I don't believe so. Anyway, immediately, he made them leave. Now, why did he do that? He did not want his disciples to get caught up in the zeal of it, of making him a king. They had the susceptibility of the passion to make him king as well. He didn't want that. So he's going to send them away. Go with me to Matthew chapter 14 and verse 22. You'll get the flavor of it here in Matthew 14 and verse 22. Here's another picture of this scene. Immediately, he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him on the other side while he dismissed the crowds. He made them. This was not their choice. The 12 didn't have a choice. He made them. Jesus made them get into that boat and head off over towards Capernaum. All right? He's on that northeast side of the Sea of Galilee, and John says, go to Capernaum. Now, it's night. It's dark. And they have to row the 4-mile journey over there. They're leaving Bethsaida here, which means fish house, basically. They're going into the direction of the northeast, past Bethsaida to Capernaum. That's where we're going. Matter of fact, we don't even know if this Bethsaida Galilee even existed. Most Bible theologians don't even know that it existed, okay? This area over here, this Gennesaret Valley, certainly exists. But this area here of Bethsaida Galilee, it's questionable. There's a lot of theologians that question it. So what is Jesus doing while he puts these men in the boat? He sends them off. Now he has to dismiss the crowds, and that's no small order. They want to take him by force and make him a king. But remember, Jesus has authority. And he doesn't give in to them. Notice what our text says here in verse number 45. It says, while he dismissed the crowd, and after he had taken leave of them, he went up to the mountain to pray. So this is what the Lord Jesus is doing. He's going up and he's going to pray. The great high priest, what is he going to do here? He is going to pray for his own. He's going to pray for these disciples, right? He is interceding for his own. How's he praying for them? Probably for them to have strong faith, enduring faith, to grant to them so that they would know who he was. Remember Hebrews chapter 2, verses 17 and 18, it says this, therefore he had to be made like his brothers in every respect, so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. For because he himself has suffered when tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted. So this faithful high priest is going to a mountain. It's not like our mountains, Olympic mountains. We might say it's a hill, okay? And he's going to pray for them. All right? Notice what happens here. And when evening came, the boat was out on the sea. Now, this would have been probably the first watch of the night. Remember, they had 4 watches of the night. 6 to 9 o'clock would have been the first watch of the night. That's when they would have left to go on this journey of this 4 miles on this boat. It has the definite article with it, so it's the boat. This is the boat that these disciples and Jesus oftentimes used. The second watch of the night would have been from 9 p.m. to midnight. The third watch would have been from 12 a.m. to 3 a.m. And the fourth watch of the night would have been from 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. All right? So he's sending these disciples away during the first watch of the night. Maybe 7 to 8 p.m. We don't know the exact timing, but he's sending them away. It's dark. They're rowing, okay? Now I want you to see something here in verse number 47 through 50. And when evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. Now Mark's trying to tell you something here. There's a real problem. Where are they? They're on the sea. Okay? Now, these were expert fishermen, the Bible says, but the boat was out on the sea. The Net Bible has it like this. When evening came, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on land. That's the problem. They're not tracking up here. No, they're here. They're in the middle of the lake. Now, we got to put all the Gospels together to give us a full picture here of what's happening. Matthew 14:24 tells us that they were a long way from land. John 6:18 through 19 tells us that they were 3 to 4 miles out in the lake, and it was because of a strong wind. So here they are. They're out in the middle of the lake here, and they're not close to land at all. That's the problem. And where is Jesus? If you go back to Mark chapter 4 and verse 35, and I'm not asking you to go there, but remember when we studied through that, who's in the boat with these disciples? When that tempestuous storm comes up on the lake, Jesus was asleep in the boat. Well, that's okay, right? But where is he now? He's on land. And they're in the middle of the lake by themselves without Jesus being in the boat. That's the problem. Now, so let's say they were sent out at 7 or 8 o'clock p.m., then been out there toiling on the tempestuous sea for 8, maybe 9 hours, okay? And they're in serious trouble, okay? Notice what the text says here. And when evening came, verse 47, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the shore. And he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them, and about the fourth watch of the night. So that puts us between 3 o'clock a.m. and 6 o'clock a.m. So they've been out there for maybe 8 hours, toiling against this fierce wind. That's the problem. Probably the boat had been taking on water, and notice what happens here, all right? And he saw, verse 48, that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. And about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea. He meant to pass by them. Now that's probably a bad, we can get a better translation than that in the original, okay? He meant to pass by them. Really, what does that mean? Was he just going to walk past them? No. It's not really a good translation. Literally it reads, he desired to come alongside them. Here he is. It's early in the morning. It is dark. It's a storm. And he's going to come alongside them. It wasn't that he wanted to leave that little group of men there to be drowned. He knew exactly where they were. I mean, he could have tracked from here over to here, but he knew where they were. He goes right where they were. Tarasso is a strong verb there, okay, that's used in the Greek. It means to cause great distress, trouble. They were disturbed, right? It literally means to be thrown into a panic. Now, where do you get the panic here, okay? Notice, he meant to pass by them. Verse 49, but when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost. And they what? Cried out. There's where the panic is, right? It means to be thrown into panic. Now, probably for the last 6 or 8 hours, they've been yelling at each other in the boat anyway. All right? Now they are screaming out of their minds in a huge panic. There's no way to process this. When's the last time you saw somebody walking on the water? You know? I mean, a person walking on the water. What does he do? What does Jesus do? According to verse 50, he speaks to them. Notice what it says. For they all saw him and were terrified. They're in a huge panic here. But immediately he spoke to them and said, take heart, it is I, do not be afraid. I love those words, you know. Take heart, it is I. In other words, guys, get a grip. Get a handle on yourselves. Be brave at this time. That's what he's stirring them up to do. Take courage, right? That phrase is used some 8 times in the New Testament. Take courage. 7 times in the Gospel and once in Acts 23, it speaks about Paul taking courage and encouraged to take courage. But every time it is said by Jesus to someone else. Take courage. Jesus is the very source that these men would need to be brave. Don't be afraid. Boy, that phrase stretches from Genesis all the way to the book of the Revelation at least 100+ times. It's huge. Don't be afraid. Psalm 5, verse 11, but let all who take refuge in you rejoice. Let them ever sing for joy and spread your protection over them, and those who love your name may exalt in you. David, the psalmist, said in Psalm 18, verses 1 through 3, I love you, O Lord, my strength, the rock. The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my rock in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. I call upon the Lord who is worthy to be praised, and I am saved. I love that passage. So the lesson is, if you belong to the Lord, you don't need to fear. That's what he's telling these disciples here. By the way, these are the 12 apostles. The kingdom is in that little boat, right? I mean, that's where the kingdom, the health of the future kingdom is in that boat. Man, those guys go down, and who's going to proclaim, right? This glorious message. I mean, it was these men that have turned the world upside down. I mean, it was these apostles. And Mark leaves it out, but Mark wrote his gospel from Rome to the Gentiles. But there's one thing that's left out of this story, and what do you think it is? Peter walking on the water. Mark leaves it out. He's a close associate of Peter. Peter probably didn't want his name mentioned. He's been humbled, but Mark leaves it out. In Matthew chapter 14, verses 27 and 28, but immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, take heart, it is I, do not be afraid. And Peter answered him these words, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. Now, if I were to ask you a question, why would any sane man ask that question? Those waves probably were 6, 7 feet tall. This boat is being swamped. We notice that in Mark chapter 4, that story, that narrative, that it's safer to be in a boat with Jesus on a storm, and it's all okay. I really firmly believe that the reason why Peter asked to walk out to Jesus is because he was so terrified. That's why he did it. No sane man would want to get out of a boat and walk out on a storm like that. It wasn't that he processed it all and said, hey, Jesus is walking on the water. I think I'd like to try that tonight or this morning. You know, it was early in the morning. I think he thought, it's better to be with Jesus on the water, walking on the water, than in a boat that had probably been taking on a great deal of water, right? I think Peter, however, is scared to death, like the other disciples were. You know what he says to me? He says to Jesus these words, "Command me to come to you." That's a spirit of humility. Peter had been greatly humbled. They had been rowing for probably 8 hours. They are fatigued. They're about ready to go down. And finally, Jesus comes, right? Command me to come. That is a man under submission. There's no human solution to this problem. Command me to come. Fear turns into faith. Let me say this. He gets out of the boat. He begins to walk on the water. He has faith. And then doubt comes. It's not easy to have faith when walking on the water. That's a new experience. Maybe God will call you to some new experiences in your life. To witness to somebody and you're afraid. What are they going to think of me? What are they going to say about me? If I invite them out to this banquet coming up where they can hear the gospel and fall in love with Jesus, that can be a fearful thing for some of our hearts, right? I mean, honest, genuine trust mingled with actual doubt. And he began, according to Matthew's account in chapter 14, he began to what? Sink. Jesus wanted these guys to realize, if you are mine, you are safe. You are secure. Jesus shows them how protected they were with him. By the way, let me say this. Faith will sustain you through anything. Faith. Four times in Matthew alone, the Lord said, "O ye of little faith." Now, what was the impact, all right? If you go to Matthew chapter 4 and verse 32, the wind ceased, right? When he got into the boat with them. And they worshiped him. Now, notice here in Mark chapter 6, that's where we're at. He says in verse 50, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." And he got in the boat with them, and the wind ceased. Verse 51. And they were utterly what? Astounded. They were astounded. So, in other texts, they stopped and they worshiped him afterwards. So, they went from wondering to worshiping. Peter the next day said, "Where are we going to go, Lord?" He said, "Will you leave me also?" And he said, "Where are we going to go, Lord?" The third thing I see here is not only his prayer, but his power. The third thing I see is the Master's presence here in verse 51 and verse 52. and the wind ceased, and they were astounded. And remember, these guys were out of their minds. Job chapter 26 and verse 14 says, "But the thunder of his power, who can understand?" Habakkuk 3:15, "You trampled the sea with your horses, the surging of the mighty waters." Job chapter 9 and verse 8 says this, "He treads on the way of the sea." It's interesting. We're going to go to John here just shortly because I want you to see it. But I just happen to believe when I get to heaven someday I'm going to ask him. But I believe that Jesus walked across that water and there wasn't a drop of water on him as he walked across that sea. Now that's my speculation. You can have your speculation if you want. The text doesn't tell me. I must confess. Go with me to John 6 and verse 21. Here's another miracle that happened. I want you to see it. This miracle convinced these disciples that Jesus Christ was in fact the bread of life, and there was no other place for them to be than with Jesus. John chapter 6 and verse 21 reads, "Then they were glad to take him into the boat." I love that. They were just glad to get him in the boat. And immediately, John's going to use this word, and immediately the boat was at the land in which they were going. This is another miracle. All of a sudden the boat goes from here and it goes to here. Immediately. A miracle. Not another row. Not another toil. No, Jesus got in the boat and immediately they were in the area of Gennesaret, adjacent to Capernaum up here. That's where they land. That's where they go to. Oh, well, I want to finish this chapter. Hang with me, will you? Let me give you the master's personality here. Verses 53 through 56. When they had crossed over, immediately, all right, that boat just landed there. They came to the land at Gennesaret and moored to the shore. And when they got out of the boat, the people immediately recognized him and ran about the whole region and began to bring the sick people on their beds to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he came, in villages and cities or countryside, they laid the sick in the marketplaces and implored him that they might touch even the fringe of his garment, and as many as touched it were made well. And where does that drive you back to in Mark's gospel? All the way back to Mark chapter 5. And remember the woman with the issue of blood? Who touched that message of healing for that woman with the issue of blood had to have lit a fire in the whole Galilean region. That if we could just touch the hem of his garment, we'd be healed. And that's what people are doing. That's just common grace, isn't it? No discrimination. His healing was for everybody. This is really compassion at its finest, divine compassion. And so the question is, what do you want from Jesus? As you seek after Jesus, what do you want? Do you want the bread of life? Or do you just want the bread and the fishes? Where does your hunger lie? I leave you with that, okay? All right, we'll end with that thought, okay?